All right. Well, thank y'all for joining us, either live or watching the recording of this. We're going to talk about plastics in the ocean today, and we have a guest speaker from the University of Southern Mississippi's Gulf Coast Research Lab, which is located in Ocean Springs, and she's nearby in Biloxi, as so many people are at their homes these days working. So, introduce Jessi James, and thank you so much for being here, especially on short notice.
Yeah, it's no problem. And like I said, I'm really glad we got Zoom to work today so I could be here. Um, so, like you said, my name is Jessi James. I actually work at the Marine Education Center, which is a part of the Gulf Coast Research Lab, which is ultimately a part of the University of Southern Mississippi. So I am currently in Biloxi. Our center is in Ocean Springs, but of course we're all kind of confined to our homes at the moment. So that's why I've got this lovely background so you don't have to see my dirty house. But I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that I get to talk to you guys about plastics and microplastics. So just a few things that we're going to go through real quick. Then, like I said, I do have some information that I'd like to show you guys that's pretty interesting about microplastics. So I'm not going to read this entire slide, but plastics are made from several different elements. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen are typically found in plastics, and they have a pretty high molecular weight. So that means that these molecules are able to hold lots of atoms together. So plastics are, we know, very strong. They're cheap and easy to make sometimes, and they're really, really good to use in particular situations. So, I get asked about microplastics a lot, and, what are my opinions as a marine biologist and things like that. Plastics are almost a necessary evil. They're not super great, we've come to find out. They're really bad for the environment, like we're going to talk about in the next few slides, but they're really efficient and they're really good to use, especially when you're trying to keep from like cross-contaminating things. Or if you, don't have any other options available, plastics are a really good one. We could stray away from using plastic water bottles every day, but if you wear contacts, you have to use plastic. Or if you're in the medical field or receiving medical care, there's going to be plastic involved. So I like to tell people that, plastic can be bad, but it can also be very good and be used for a good purpose. And if you ever look on the back of your plastic bottles or your goods that come in plastic, sometimes you could see what the packaging is made out of, along with the ingredients. So a lot of our plastics are made out of polyethylene, polypropylene. Polystyrene is going to be your styrofoam products. And all of these are essentially plastics. They all have these polymers that make up what we're using as plastics.
And styrofoam might be the one of the most useful ones because it keeps cold things cold and warm things warm with food and beverages. But it's also the only one that I've never found any way that there can be to recycle it.
Exactly. In going right into recycling, if you've ever seen these numbers on the back of your plastic products, that's exactly what this has to deal with, is recycling. Numbers are, like I said, on the back of those products, and those are coded to particular plastic materials. So like we talked about the polyethylene and the polypropylene, the polystyrene. So the polystyrene, especially, your egg cartons, to-go packaging, things like that. I know that personally my recycling company that takes it from my house will not take polystyrene. And like you just said, I haven't really found any place that'll take polystyrene. And I know from doing some research on my own of looking into what I can and can't recycle at my house, I think I can only recycle number 1, 1, and 2.
Yeah, that's
so
common.
3 through 7, I can't even recycle. And that just makes it, harder and harder to try to get rid of. So if we're putting, 3 through 7 into the trash bin and that ends up in the dump somewhere, what happens to that plastic? And essentially, that's how we end up with microplastics. So the plastics that can't be recycled into other plastics or some other medium ends up getting broken down into smaller plastics. So even if it's not degrading, it's getting churned up or broken and kind of like tore apart into these smaller and smaller pieces. And to be considered a microplastic, it has to be less than 5 millimeters long. And a lot of times we talk about microplastics being in the ocean. As we all know from Finding Nemo, that everything basically ends up in the ocean. Even if you live in the Midwest, in the middle of the United States, your plastic impact is going to impact the ocean and the Gulf of Mexico in some way. So we are actually in a perfect watershed of in between Mississippi and Louisiana with the Mississippi River. Anything that we're doing inland is going to go into the Mississippi River and then down into the Gulf of Mexico. So even the things that are happening in Lafayette, if someone doesn't recycle a water bottle correctly, or if it ends up in a dump, and then it becomes a microplastic, it could eventually end up into the Gulf of Mexico pretty easily. So like I just said, microplastics come from a variety of sources. They can be from plastic debris that just gets smaller and smaller. And too, that on recycling, you can do your best to recycle, and that's great. But sometimes it happens. Sometimes, that water bottle makes it onto the recycling truck, and then, wind pulls it out of the recycling truck, and then it ends up into the watershed. So it's really important that we, make our best effort into recycling things properly, but ultimately straying away from plastic where we can. So like I said, it's important to use in some places and in some situations, but it's ultimately best if we try to, find a different way around plastic.
Yeah,
so
getting back to the watershed comment, we learned earlier this year about how a third of the United States, continental U.S., drains down the Mississippi River. So like you were saying, anything in that, it's the Louisiana Purchase was intentionally, and then everything else that was already the Mississippi, already in the Mississippi watershed. So it's a big chunk. But when you look at it historically, it looks a lot like the Louisiana Purchase, because it is, with the exception of what was already part of the U.S.
Exactly. And so you can have watersheds on watersheds. That's a good point too. And, honestly, that's a whole nother soapbox of a topic I could get on. But I know locally, so I live on the Chudacabuff River here in Biloxi. That's its own watershed. We have the Pascagoula watershed, the Pearl River watershed. But particularly Louisiana and Mississippi both belong to the lower Mississippi watershed. And that does ultimately run into the Gulf of Mexico. So, us being in our individual houses, we're both contributing to the same place, which is kind of interesting. Plastic debris can come in all shapes and sizes, but ultimately it's that less than 5 millimeters is what they're considering a microplastic. So that's the true definition of a microplastic. Anything bigger is just going to be plastic. Like I said, if the plastics aren't getting recycled and they're ending up in the ocean and they're turning into microplastics, they still never, ever go away. They're being either upcycled into the environment, our fish are eating them, they're in our drinking water, or they're getting broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, and there's still trace amounts of them everywhere.
Yeah, when you talk about nanoplastics, I think one I just heard about maybe a year or so ago was the fibers in clothes. When you wash clothes in the washing machine, the filters don't even catch, or the filters at the water treatment plants don't catch those because they're so small, but they're still plastic, and they get out there, and that's totally innocent. Nobody was doing anything wrong in that case.
Exactly, and that's what I mean by, we could be doing everything possible to get rid of the plastic in our lives and correctly recycle and things like that, but it's still happening whether we're attuned to that or not, and it's kind of out of our control. And honestly, talking about plastic's kind of a big bummer when you think about it, but if you think about what good plastic is doing in the world, if you think about it from that angle, plastic can be a good thing. We just have to figure out how to make it better, I guess, is how we're changing. So we're kind of moving from this plastic is bad, plastic is evil to, plastic's necessary. How do we make it better for the environment? And I'm glad you brought that up about the fibers. I've got a really cool photo to show you guys about some fibers here in a second. So microbeads are a type of microplastic that was a big kind of buzzword in the news a few years ago. We used to find microbeads in our face wash and our body scrubs, especially in toothpaste. And those are just like the little exfoliating beads that are in our beauty products. And actually, I think might have been 2015, they actually passed a law that said, you can't put these in our products anymore, you have to get rid of them. So there was legislation that was passed to prevent that. Companies are still trying to phase those out. So you can actually still find some products with microbeads in them in the store, but they're not allowed to produce them anymore. So, going back to plastics, they're bad for us, they're bad for the environment, but they're definitely bad for our creatures that live in our rivers and streams and in the ocean. So turtles, if you don't know, love, love, love jellyfish. It's one of their very favorite snacks. And when you put a plastic bag into the ocean, or if it winds up in the ocean, it looks just like a jellyfish. So even, not even on a micro or a nano scale, but these plastics are hurting our macro animals, our large animals, just as much as they're hurting our smaller animals by ingesting the microbeads and the microplastics and things like that. So
now we see all those trash bags floating behind you in the background. Oh no, those are jellyfish.
Exactly.
That's right, jellyfish.
This was a really good cause of background today. And then the last part of this slideshow is talking about how long does it take for plastic to actually break down. So a water bottle or a soda bottle, those are going to be those malleable plastic bottles that are normally made out of polyethylene. Those are going to take about 450 to 1,000 years to break down. And by breaking down, they just mean that it's not visible to the human eye anymore. So it doesn't go away. It doesn't just magically and chemically dissolve. All of those plastic chemicals and, nanoplastics are still there. So when it's saying breakdown, it's just saying that we can't really physically see it anymore. Grocery bags, those are the high density polyethylene. Those are going to take anywhere from 10 to 100 years. And then detergent bottles, which is also high density polyethylene, are going to take about 500 to 1,000 years. So that's not even in my grandchildren's lifetimes. Those are great grandchildren's lifetimes that they won't be able to see those plastics anymore, but we're going to be seeing effects of those for such a long time. Plastics can be good, but there just has to be some sort of way that we can make them better and make them more efficient and better for the environment. So that way we can continue to use them and continue to
keep them because we can look around, like when we're in the classroom, and all the things that are plastic, if you had to come up with a replacement for them, what would they be? I mean, like wood and metal is about all you have left, and some of those things don't seem like they'd work out. And I know weight is another one too. Plastic is very lightweight for its durability, so we don't even think about all the plastic that's around us.
And like I said too, it's a little overwhelming to think about plastic. And I actually work with some people that's their whole job, is working with plastics and how they affect the environment. And they pretty much tell me, my job's a bummer. I've got to talk to kids all day about how plastic is ruining the environment. So this photo are not plastics that I found, but they're plastics that these scientists found on the ground outside, just like you have done, just around their building. And this is what they found. A lot of those aren't considered microplastics. They're bigger than the 5 millimeters. But there are, if you look a little bit closer, there are smaller pieces and things like that. And it took them only about 30 minutes to find what's in this dish. So that's pretty amazing. All of those fibers and threads that are left over from their, their fisheries departments, where they're fixing and cleaning nets outside. There's lots of plastic from what looks like water bottles and things like that. So it's pretty crazy to think that this was just right out their front door.
And you're talking about the filtering. I know the Audubon Aquarium in New Orleans has some equipment that they have to use to, they can take a water sample and squeeze it through the filters, probably the same thing that you may have used to figure out or find out what's actually in water or a liquid.
Did it look something like this?
Pretty close, yes. I don't think it was that fancy. It looks like a pump right there. I think we have to actually, by hand, push it through.
So with the filters, this is what one looks like up close. So the filter size is, it's about 47 millimeters across. And if you're looking at each individual square, it's 0.4 millimeters a square. So you're looking at a very, very tiny square on that filter through a microscope. So I took this photo from the microscope. Can you see where the micro thread is? It is right here. So across. So all of this brown stuff that's kind of around on the filter is any kind of dirt particles and things like that that have shown up. But that microfiber has found its way onto the filter along with other microplastics, and they're able to kind of count and take a number of how many things are in that water sample. And then, like I said, they're doing lots of research on it. Okay, so I do have a little container of nurdles. There's exactly 96 in here. I did count them. Because they are used for research. So a nurdle, just to back up a little bit, a nurdle is a little plastic pellet that we can use for a couple different things. So we're using them to make other plastic products. So it would be easier to ship these little pellets across the country in order to make plastic products than it would be to make them and then ship all of those products somewhere else. And they look like this.
Stories about trains that carry them and ships at sea, and they've dumped over the side and all these nurdles get loose.
Exactly. And so especially on our beaches down here, we have Colbert Islands, that are right down along the Mississippi coast, and those kind of hug our coastlines, and they protect us from a lot of things, including a lot of pollution and trash and things like that. So we can actually find nurdles on our beaches, but only really in one area, which is interesting because of those barrier islands. So we can find them in Bay St. Louis, which is over towards the Louisiana border. It's closer to you guys.
Now, let me ask, when it comes to human health, what is the effect of, and we watched a video this week, or watching a video this week, about ingestion of plastics and microplastics. So what are some of the things that you know about the impacts or possible impacts to our health if they're making their way, let's say, into the fish that we eat?
Mm-hmm. To be honest, I don't know. And I don't think a lot of scientists do know. This is kind of a brand new topic. Plastics are actually very new. They only came out, in the early 1900s. So, definitely in the 40s and the 50s is when plastic started to get really big. Still kind of a very new concept. And I think, just within recent years of this big push of don't use plastic straws, save the turtles, we're fixing the ocean, is also a very new concept. And then, like I said earlier about us realizing, our washing machines aren't picking up all the materials that are being pushed out into our water systems. And there's a lot of human impact that we're just now realizing how big of an impact that is on our lives daily. There's a ton of research being done now by very curious and smart people that are helping. So like I said, in the future, I hope that we have some better answers on that. But right now, it just kind of seems like a work in progress. And for sure, our fish are getting into the plastics. They're in your yard, all sorts of places very near to you, the water drinking systems that we have, and they're definitely impacting us.
I think I asked the question I wanted to was about the human impact. I wanted to know what was known about that. Like you said, there's still not a lot known. It's just kind of like we deal with a lot of things in science currently that we still don't know what's going on, as important as they may be, and as curious as people might be. Appreciate that. That was a lot of great information you provided there about plastics and microplastics and the problems and especially the breaking down. I think that's one thing that most people don't get is that plastics are out there. They don't biodegrade, but they just get smaller and smaller and smaller, and they retain their molecular structure. And so they're still plastic, and the impacts are largely unknown, but they're probably not good outcomes in many cases.
Exactly. And I think too, I have a lot of non-scientist friends that, kind of turn to me for advice and things like that as far as environmental issues. But a lot of them are like, oh no, I recycled it. It's gone. It's fixed. That's I did my part, but they don't really realize what happens after that, or in lieu of that kind of thing. So I have to be the bearer of bad news a lot and tell them what actually happens. But I think that goes for a lot of the general public is, do they know what happens to our trash? Do they realize what happens after their recycling is taken away from their home? And I think that, it just brings up a really good conversation as daily things that they do that we don't really understand the processes for them, and then what happens with those things. And a lot of that has to do with, we can't see the impact of it on ourselves daily, so it makes it harder for us to care about those things. But it's been great the past 5, 6, 7 years for the ocean that unfortunately we're seeing a lot of impact visibly, and that's kind of raised a red flag for a lot of us that we need to do something and we need to help.